In this video, we're going to talk about how stars like ours form, how they evolve, and eventually how they die out over long periods of time. We have stars because of gravity. And we see that within each star there are two opposing forces. There's going to be gravity that's trying to pull everything in towards the center of that star. And then we're also going to have nuclear energy causing the star to expand outwards. So these two opposing forces, gravity pulling something in and contracting it, and then that thermal energy causing it to expand, it causes stars to find an equilibrium. They're not going to get smaller and they're not going to get larger because gravity and the thermal energy are balancing each other out. But these main sequence stars all have the same type of birth. They form in those nebulae. We talked about these in our last chapter when we were talking about how our solar system evolved. We had this huge cloud of dust and particles called a nebulae that started contracting. And gravity starts contracting this cloud and pulling all of the material closer to the center. But as it's pulling all this material closer to the center, those particles are starting to collide. And as they collide, they start producing heat, causing it to warm up very quickly. And if enough heat is produced, that material can ignite. It can catch on fire and become a protostar, or a very early, very young star. Once that protostar has ignited, we're going to see that gravity continues to try to pull all of those gases into a more confined space. And by doing this, it's going to cause the core, the innermost part of the star, to heat up so that it's over 10 million degrees. But because it's so hot, each atom is going to begin to fuse together. We can have two hydrogen atoms, when they collide under a really hot temperature, like 10 million degrees, they're going to be able to collide into a larger atom. In this atom, because we have two atoms, each only having one proton combining, our new atom will not have two protons, and it will be a new element called helium. So when we have two hydrogen fusing together, it creates a new element called helium. And when this helium is produced, it releases a lot of energy. And the energy, we know it as sunlight. It's producing light and heat from the star as those atoms begin to fuse together through a process called hydrogen fusion. But as all of this is happening, as these atoms collide and fuse together, they are producing heat and energy that cause the star to expand. But remember that outward expansion, that outward pressure is balanced by gravity. They equal each other out. And when this happens, that star becomes a really stable main sequence star. It's kind of the middle in both size and luminosity in compared to the other two groups of stars. When we look at our main sequence stars, we'll see that they all age at different rates. And their aging is going to depend on their size. When we're looking at massive stars, because they're so large in size, they're going to have to use a lot of fuel. So they're going to run out of fuel very quickly and only exist for a few million years. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if we're looking at really tiny stars, because they're so small in size, they use very little fuel. So because they're using so little fuel, they're going to be able to last for hundreds of billions of years. So this analogy is kind of similar to if I gave two different vehicles a gallon of gas. So here I'm giving gas to either a Toyota Corolla or a big old Ford 350. That Ford F-350 is much massive in size compared to the Corolla. It's going to use fuel faster. So it's going to run out of gasoline faster than that smaller Corolla that uses less fuel. And we see the exact same thing happening with our stars. The bigger the star is, the faster it uses fuel, so it runs out quicker, having a short life. But our smaller stars use fuel much more slowly. And because they're using fuel slowly, they're going to exist for significantly longer periods of time. But we're going to be able to trace the history of a star from birth to death. And we see that about 90% of a star's life is in this main sequence period. Once that main sequence star starts running out of fuel, though, it's going to turn from a main sequence star into one of those red giants. So as we start running out of hydrogen, it's going to start migrating outward. We're going to see that the surface of the star is going to expand. It's going to get larger in size, which is actually going to allow the surface to cool down, which is what's going to cause that red color instead of it being like a bright white. But after it expands and cools down, the core of this star is going to begin to collapse in. Because now, instead of combining two hydrogen atoms to create helium, now we're going to start combining two helium atoms to create carbon, an even bigger atom. But eventually, all of the helium is going to be converted to carbon. It's going to run out of nuclear fuel. And then gravity is going to take hold. It's going to start squeezing the star until it begins contracting into a very, very small star. This diagram is just going to lead us through stellar evolution, how the life of a star evolves. Stars all start off from this molecular cloud. That cloud is going to condense and ignite into a protostar. And as that protostar begins producing fuel, it's going to transition into a main sequence star. Our sun is a main sequence star right now. But eventually, all main sequence stars will start running out of fuel. It's going to run out of hydrogen, and instead it's going to create carbon by combining two helium atoms together. When this happens, it's going to form a red giant. Because we're forming a larger carbon molecule, it's expanding in size. When it expands in size, the surface is going to cool down until eventually it's going to start collapsing in on itself, forming a planetary nebula. Eventually, we're going to see that it's going to collapse even more into a white dwarf. And this is basically just going to be the very innermost core of that star. And over time, it's going to cool down even more, becoming dimmer and dimmer until eventually we can't see it in our sky anymore. So far, the pattern for stars' life cycles have been the same regardless of which star we're looking at. But when we look at when stars begin to die, they're going to be very different depending on their mass. So on this side, we're going to be talking about solar mass. And solar mass is just in comparison to our own star. So for example, if it says 0.5 solar mass, it just means that that star is half of the size of our star. So we're going to be able to break our stars into low mass, intermediate mass, and massive stars based on how large it is in comparison to our own star. Starting off with our low mass stars, the ones that are smaller than half the size of our star, once it starts running out of fuel, that red giant is going to collapse and become a white dwarf. But if we're looking at an intermediate star, this is one that has a solar mass between half the size of our sun and 8 times the size of our sun. With these, as that red giant runs out of fuel and begins to collapse, it's going to form that planetary nebula first, and then the white dwarf. But we're going to see that our massive stars, the ones that are larger than 8 times our star, is going to die very, very differently in something that's called a supernova. And a supernova is kind of like an explosion of all the stellar material that the inside can condense and create an incredibly hot, dense object that is either a neutron star or a black hole. And we'll talk about both of these types of objects in our next video. But we have a lot of picture evidence of this going on in different locations of our universe. Both of these photos are just different planetary nebulas. What has happened after a red giant has ran out of fuel and it's on its way to eventually becoming a white dwarf.